Step back in time with me, to the mid-18th century. We're walking the cobblestone streets of Boston, a crown jewel of the British colonies in North America. Take a deep breath. Can you smell it? The salty air from the harbor, mingling with the scent of wood smoke from countless chimneys, and the sweet aroma of baking bread from a nearby shop. This is a city teeming with life, a bustling port where ships from across the Atlantic arrive daily, their masts like a dense forest against the skyline. Look around. The streets are a hive of activity. Merchants in powdered wigs hurry to their counting houses. Sailors with weathered faces share tales and languages from a dozen different ports. And artisans, their hands stained with their trade, hammer and saw in open-front workshops. Children chase hoops down narrow lanes, their laughter echoing off the brick and timber-framed buildings. In the evenings, the warm, flickering glow of candlelight spills from tavern windows. Places like the Green Dragon or the Bell in Hand, where conversations buzz over mugs of ale. From the outside, Boston seems like a prosperous, orderly colonial town, proudly flying the Union Jack. The rhythm of daily life of church bells, market days, and ships' arrivals seems steady, unshakable. The colonists here are, for the most part, loyal subjects of the king, proud of their English heritage. They speak the king's English, follow English law, and toast the king's health. Life is governed by tradition, by the seasons, and by the authority of a crown an ocean away. But if you listen closely, past the noise of the shipyards and the chatter of the marketplace, you can hear a different sound. It's a low murmur, a whisper of discontent that weaves its way through the city's seemingly calm surface. In those candlelit taverns, after the second pint of ale, the talk turns from shipping news to something else. Words like liberty, rights, and tyranny are spoken, first in hushed tones, then with growing conviction. You see, for all its appearance of calm, Boston is a city on edge. The colonists feel the weight of British rule not as a protective embrace, but as a tightening grip. They see the redcoats patrolling their streets, not as fellow countrymen, but as an occupying force. They feel the sting of taxes levied by a distant parliament where they have no voice, no representation. Every new act, every new tax from the Sugar Act to the Stamp Act is not just an economic burden. It's an insult, a chipping away at what they believe are their fundamental rights as Englishmen. Imagine being a merchant, your livelihood dependent on trade, suddenly facing mountains of new paperwork and taxes that make it nearly impossible to turn a profit. Or a printer, like Benjamin Eads at the Boston Gazette, who risks his business, and perhaps his freedom, to print articles critical of the crown. Or just an ordinary citizen, a cooper or a blacksmith, who feels the growing frustration that the fruits of your hard labor are being siphoned off to fill the coffers of a distant empire. This is the hidden tension of Boston. It's in the heated debates in the Massachusetts Assembly, where men like James Otis and Samuel Adams are beginning to articulate a radical new vision of self. It's in the secret meetings of groups like the Sons of Liberty, who are organizing, planning, and preparing for a confrontation they feel is inevitable. They are lawyers, merchants, and artisans by day, but by night, they are patriots, dreaming of a different future. The city is a paradox. It's a place of deep loyalty and simmering rebellion, of quiet compliance and defiant protest. Outwardly, the routines of colonial life continue. Families gather for supper, ships unload their cargo, and the town crier announces the day's news. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, the ground is shifting. Ideas, powerful and transformative, are taking root in the minds of the people. They are beginning to see themselves not just as colonists, but as Americans. This period isn't marked by grand battles or declarations. Not yet. It's a time of quiet determination, of whispered conversations, and shared grievances. It's a psychological turning point, where a population's identity begins to change. The air itself feels thick with unspoken questions. What does it mean to be free? Who has the right to govern? And what price are we willing to pay for our liberty? So as we stand here on these historic streets, remember that this calm is fragile. It's the deep, quiet breath a storm takes before it unleashes its fury. The arguments being honed in Boston's taverns and townhouses will soon echo across the 13 colonies. The seeds of revolution are being sown in this fertile ground of frustration and aspiration. The storm is gathering just over the horizon, and Boston, T's bustling, vibrant, and uneasy city, is right in its path. The world is about to change forever, and it all begins here, in the calm before the storm. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, where the storm finally begins to break. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. Last time, we explored the simmering tensions after the 7 Years' War. Today, we're diving into Chapter 2, the British Empire's heavy hand, and unpacking the policies that turned colonial frustration into a full-blown crisis. Imagine this. You've just fought alongside Britain in a massive global war, and instead of a thank you, you get a bill. A really big bill. That's exactly how the American colonists felt. The 7 Years' War, known as the French and Indian War in America, had been incredibly expensive, doubling Britain's national debt. Bacon London Parliament looked across the Atlantic and saw a source of revenue. The colonies, they argued, should pay their fair share for the protection the British military provided. This logic set the stage for a decade of conflict, not with cannons and muskets, but with taxes and laws. The first major blow landed in 1764 with the Sugar Act. Now, there was an older Molasses Act, but it was rarely enforced. The Sugar Act was different. It actually lowered the tax on molasses, but, and this is the crucial part, Britain intended to collect it. They beefed up customs enforcement and set up new courts to prosecute smugglers without a jury of their peers. For the colonists, this wasn't just about the money. It was about principle. This was an external tax, levied by a parliament where they had no representatives. It felt like a power grab, a direct challenge to their rights as Englishmen to be taxed only by their own consent. Merchants in port cities like Boston and New York were hit hardest, and their grumbling grew louder. But the Sugar Act was just the warm-up. The very next year, 1765, Parliament dropped a bombshell: the Stamp Act. This was the first direct tax ever imposed on the colonies. It required a stamp, which you had to pay for, on almost every piece of paper. We're talking newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, pamphlets, even diplomas. Suddenly, it wasn't just merchants who were angry. It was everyone. Lawyers couldn't file documents, printers couldn't publish, and sailors couldn't even play a game of cards without paying the crown. The reaction was immediate and explosive. All across the colonies, a powerful slogan emerged: no taxation without representation. This wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was the core of their argument. They believed they could only be taxed by their own elected assemblies, like the Virginia House of Burgesses or the Massachusetts Assembly. Parliament, thousands of miles away, had no right to reach directly into their pockets. Protests erupted. Groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty formed, led by figures like Samuel Adams. They weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. They organized boycotts of British goods, making sure local merchants didn't import anything from the mother country. They also used intimidation. Stamp distributors were threatened, their property was destroyed, and many were forced to resign before they even sold a single stamp. In Boston, an effigy of the stamp distributor, Andrew Oliver, was hung from a tree, the original Liberty Tree. The pressure was so intense that by the time the act was supposed to take effect, there was practically no one left to enforce it. The colonial assemblies also took action. The Virginia House of Burgesses passed a series of resolutions, known as the Virginia Resolves, boldly declaring that only their own legislature had the right to tax Virginia. This inspired other colonies. Soon, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York for the Stamp Act Congress, the first time they had united to formally protest British policy. They sent a unified petition to the King and Parliament, making their case. The message was clear: we are loyal British subjects, but we demand our rights. Faced with this united opposition and feeling the economic pain from the colonial boycotts, British merchants pressured Parliament to act. In 1766, they finally repealed the Stamp Act. The colonies celebrated with fireworks and bonfires. It felt like a huge victory, but in their joy, many overlooked a crucial detail. On the very same day, they repealed the Stamp Act. Parliament passed another law, the Declaratory Act. This act stated, in no uncertain terms, that Parliament had the absolute right to make laws and statutes to bind the colonies and people of America, ... in all cases whatsoever. Essentially, they were saying, okay, we'll back down on this one tax, but don't get it twisted. We are still in charge. The Declaratory Act was a ticking time bomb, a constitutional showdown waiting to happen. The immediate crisis was over, but the fundamental disagreement about power and authority was left unresolved. The peace didn't last long. In 1767, the Chancellor of the Charles Townshend, came up with a new plan to raise money from the colonies. These became known as the Townshend Acts. Townshend was clever, or so he thought. He reasoned that the colonists had objected to direct asterisks taxes, like the Stamp Act. So he proposed indirect asterisks taxes duties, on imported goods like glass, lead, paper, paint, and, most famously, the money raised would be used to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. Why was that a problem? Before this, colonial assemblies controlled the salaries of these officials. It was their power of the purse, a crucial check on British authority. If a governor acted against the colony's interests, the assembly could threaten to withhold his pay. By having the crown pay these salaries directly with tax revenue, the Townshend Acts would make these officials independent of colonial control and solely loyal to Britain. The colonists saw right through it. They recognized it as another attempt to strip away their self. The old cry of no taxation without representation was heard once again. The response was familiar, but more organized this time. The colonies revived their boycotts of British goods. Women played a huge role, forming groups called the Daughters of Liberty. They held spinning bees to produce homespun cloth so they wouldn't have to buy British textiles. They brewed herbal teas to avoid the taxed British tea. This was a grassroots movement, a popular uprising that brought the politics of protest into people's homes. The intellectual resistance also ramped up. A Pennsylvania lawyer named John Dickinson published a series of essays called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Writing under a simple pseudonym, he eloquently argued that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies for the purpose of raising revenue, whether the tax was direct or indirect. His letters were reprinted in newspapers throughout the colonies and became incredibly influential, uniting public opinion against the Townshend Acts. The British government, however, was in no mood to back down again. They saw Boston as the hotbed of radicalism and decided to make an example of it. In 1768, they sent 2 regiments of British soldiers, the Redcoats, to occupy the city and enforce the law. The presence of a standing army in a city during peacetime was deeply offensive to the colonists. It was seen as an instrument of tyranny. The arrival of the troops only made things worse. Boston became a powder keg. Tensions between the soldiers and the citizens were constant. Soldiers, who were poorly paid, would compete with locals for part-time jobs, leading to brawls. Insults were traded daily. The colonists called the soldiers lobsterbacks. Because of their red coats, the situation was spiraling out of control. All of this resentment, this anger over taxes, representation, and military occupation, was building toward a breaking point. A single spark would be enough to ignite a fire that could change the world forever. And that spark was coming sooner than anyone could have imagined. The story of these taxes to Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts is more than just a list of economic policies. It's the story of a relationship breaking down. It's about a growing sense of a distinct American identity, separate from Britain. Each act, each protest, and each response pushed the two sides further apart, eroding the bonds of loyalty and affection that had once held the empire together. Thanks for watching. We've covered a lot of ground today, laying the foundation for the explosive events to come. In our next episode, we'll witness that spark ignite in the streets of Boston. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Last time, We saw how the seeds of discontent were sown with the end of the French and Indian War and the beginning of British taxation. But taxes are just numbers on a page until someone stands up and gives voice to the anger they cause. In Chapter 3, we meet the men who turned quiet, grumbling into a roar of defiance, the voices of protest. Imagine the bustling, chaotic streets of 1760s Boston. The air is thick with the smell of salt, tar, and revolution. And at the heart of this storm are three men, each a vital piece of the puzzle. First, let's talk about the mastermind, the propagandist, the political firebrand, Samuel Adams. Now, don't confuse him with his more famous cousin, John Adams. Samuel was a different breed. He wasn't a polished lawyer. In fact, he was a bit of a failure in business. But where he excelled was in understanding people and mobilizing them. He had a unique talent for taking complex political arguments and boiling them down into powerful, easy-to-understand slogans that could rally a crowd. He wrote fiery newspaper articles under various pen names, organized committees, and worked tirelessly behind the scenes, pulling the strings of public opinion. He was the architect of the protest movement, the man who knew that a revolution begins not with a bang, but with a whisper that grows into a shout. If Samuel Adams was the voice, then John Hancock was the wallet and the swagger. Hancock was one of the wealthiest men in all of colonial America. He was a merchant, a shipper, and frankly, a bit of a showman. He loved fine clothes, lavish parties, and being the center of attention. But his wealth also made him a prime target for British customs officials and their new taxes. When the British seized one of his ships, the Liberty Asterisk, on suspicion of smuggling, it caused an uproar in Boston. Hancock wasn't just some street brawler. He was a respected, powerful figure. His opposition to the taxes gave the movement a level of legitimacy and financial backing it desperately needed. When a man like John Hancock, who had so much to lose, was willing to stand up and defy the crown, people took notice. He wasn't just funding a rebellion. He was becoming a symbol of it. His bold signature on the Declaration of Independence later becoming an icon of American defiance. So we have the brains in Adams and the money in Hancock. But a revolution also needs hands. It needs a network, a way to spread information quickly and secretly. Interpol Rebetta. We all know the story of his midnight ride, but Revere was so much more than a one-hit wonder. He was a master silversmith, an artisan, and a connector of people. He was part of Boston's sprawling network of craftsmen, mechanics, and laborers, the mechanics, as they were called. These were the people who felt the sting of British policies most directly. Revere was a key member of groups like the Sons of Liberty, the muscle of the movement. He wasn't just a rider. He was an engraver, creating powerful propaganda images like his famous depiction of the Boston Massacre, which shaped public perception far beyond Boston. He was the vital link between the elite leaders like Adams and Hancock and the working people on the streets. He was the eyes and ears of the revolution, the man who could carry a message from a secret meeting to the docks in the dead of night. Together, these three men, the agitator, the aristocrat, and the artisan, formed a powerful trio. But what was the idea that united them? What was the rallying cry that brought merchants, lawyers, and blacksmiths together? It was a simple, yet profoundly powerful phrase. No taxation without representation. This wasn't just a complaint about money. It was a fundamental argument about rights. The colonists believed that as British subjects, they were entitled to the same rights as people living in England. One of the most cherished of those rights was the right to be taxed only by their own elected representatives. Parliament, they argued, was a body in which they had no voice. No one from Massachusetts or Virginia sat in the House of Commons. Therefore, Parliament had no right to take their money. It was, in their eyes, a form of theft. This wasn't a call for independence, not JIT. It was a demand for fairness, a demand to be treated as equal citizens within the British Empire. This idea was the intellectual core of the entire movement. It was the principle that Samuel Adams wrote about, that John Hancock funded the defense of, and that Paul Revere spread through the cobblestone streets. It was a line in the sand. The colonists were drawing it, and they were daring the British Empire to cross it. The stage was now set for a direct confrontation. The taxes were in place. The voices of protest were organized, and the central idea was clear. All it would take now was a spark to ignite the flame. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story is just getting started, and the tension is building. If you're enjoying this journey through history, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss Chapter 4, where things really start to heat up on the streets of Boston. We'll see you next time. Hello, history buffs, and welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. Last time, we talked about the uneasy calm that settled over the colonies after the Boston Massacre. The boycotts had largely worked, and most of the hated Townshend Acts were repealed. It seemed like things might just cool down, but, as we know, that peace was fragile. Today, we're diving into the act that didn't just break the comet, shattered it. We're talking about the Tea Act of 1773. Now, you might be thinking, a whole law just about tea. How big of a deal could that be? Well, in the 18th century, tea was more than just a drink. It was a cultural staple, a daily ritual, and a massive business. It was the coffee, the soda, and the energy drink of its time, all rolled into one. And that's where our story begins. Not in Boston or Philadelphia, but thousands of miles away, in London. The British East India Company was, to put it mildly, a corporate giant. It was a massive, powerful entity that was deeply intertwined with the British government. It had its own army, it effectively ruled over large parts of India, and it held a monopoly on all the tea imported into the British Empire. This company was, in modern terms, too big to fail. But by the early 1770s, it was on the brink of collapse. Why? A few reasons: mismanagement, corruption, and a devastating famine in Bengal had crippled its finances. But closer to home, the American boycotts of British goods had also hit them hard. Remember those non-importation agreements? They worked. The East India Company had millions of pounds of unsold tea, about 17 million pounds, to be exact, rotting in its London warehouses. This surplus was dragging the company down, and if the company went under, it threatened to take a huge chunk of the British economy with it. So, the British Parliament, many of whose members were investors in the company, had to act. They needed a bailout plan. Their solution, proposed by Prime Minister Lord North, was the Tea Act of 1773. On the surface, the act seemed pretty clever, almost like a favor to the American colonists. Here is how it worked. The law allowed the British East India Company to do something it had never been able to do before: sell its tea directly to the American colonies. Previously, the company had to sell its tea at auction in London to wholesale merchants, who then sold it to American retailers, who then sold it to the colonists. Each step added a markup. The Tea Act cut out the middleman. The company could now ship its tea straight from its warehouses to its own hand-picked agents in colonial port cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. And here is the kicker. The act also got rid of the duties the company had to pay in Britain, keeping only the small 3 pence per pound Townshend tax that had to be paid in the colonies. The result: the East India Company's tea would now be cheaper than ever before. It would be significantly cheaper than the tea sold by colonial merchants, and it would even be cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that was so popular in the colonies. From Parliament's perspective, this was a win-win. They would save their prized company. The colonists would get cheap tea, and by buying it, the colonists would implicitly accept Parliament's right to tax them. They figured no one could resist a bargain. They were wrong. Deadly run. When news of the Tea Act reached the colonies, it didn't inspire gratitude. It ignited a firestorm of fury. The colonists weren't fooled by the cheap price tag. They saw the Tea Act for what it was: a Trojan horse. First, let's talk about the merchants. Colonial merchants, who had been importing and selling tea both legal and smuggled, were going to be wiped out. The East India Company was being given a government-sanctioned monopoly that would drive them out of business. This wasn't just about tea. It was about their livelihoods. It felt like a direct attack on the colonial economy, a way for a powerful London corporation to crush local enterprise. Sound familiar? It's a debate we still have today, but the anger went far beyond the merchants. For leaders like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and the Sons of Liberty, the principle was the most dangerous part. The Tea Act was a clever trick to get Americans to accept the tax they had been fighting against for years. That little 3-pence tax, the last remaining part of the Townshend Acts, was still there. Buying this cheap tea meant swallowing the poison pill of taxation without representation. It meant admitting that Parliament had the right to tax them, a right they had fiercely denied. They saw it as a bribe. Lord North was trying to buy their consent with cheap tea. If they fell for it, what would Parliament do next? Tax their land, their windows, their very existence. For the colonists, this wasn't an economic issue. It was a constitutional crisis. It was a question of liberty versus tyranny. Colonial newspapers exploded with outrage. Pamphlets and broadsides circulated, warning that the Tea Act was the first step toward enslavement. In Philadelphia, a notice called "The Company's Agents Political Bombardiers Sent to Destroy American Freedom." In New York, the Sons of Liberty declared that anyone who aided in unloading or selling the tea was an enemy to the liberties of America. The resistance became organized and widespread. The plan was simple. Do not let the tea land. In cities like New York and Philadelphia, public pressure was so intense that the company's agents were forced to resign. When the tea ships arrived, they were convinced, or in some cases, forced, to turn around and sail back to England with their cargo still on board. In Charleston, the tea was unloaded, but it was seized by customs officials and locked away in a damp warehouse, where it rotted. But in Boston, things were different. The royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was determined to see the law enforced. He was a staunch loyalist, and to make matters more complicated, 2 of his sons were among the designated tea agents. Hutchinson refused to allow the tea ships to leave the harbor until the tax was paid. He was determined to make Bostonians bend to the will of Parliament. This set the stage for a dramatic standoff. 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, sailed into Boston Harbor, carrying over 340 chests of East India Company tea. According to the law, if the duties weren't paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival, the cargo could be seized by customs officials, sold at auction, and would inevitably end up in the hands of the colonists. The deadline for the first ship, the Dartmouth, was December 16, 1773. The citizens of Boston held massive town meetings, some with thousands in attendance, demanding that the ships be sent back. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty negotiated frantically, but Governor Hutchinson would not budge. The clock was ticking. As dusk fell on December 16th, a final, massive meeting was held at the Old South Meeting House. The crowd was tense. A message was sent to Governor Hutchinson for a final appeal to let the ships go. The answer came back: no. When the news was announced to the thousands gathered, Samuel Adams stood up and declared, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." Many historians believe this was a prearranged signal. Immediately, war whoops and cries echoed from the doorway. A group of men, loosely disguised as Mohawk warriors, burst out of the meeting house and headed for Griffin's Wharf, with hundreds, maybe thousands, of citizens following them. What happened next would echo across the Atlantic and set the colonies on an irreversible path to war. And that event, the Boston Tea Party, is exactly what we'll be covering in our next chapter. You won't want to miss it. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, please give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode in our journey through the American Revolution. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. We've seen the stage set, the taxes levied, and the quiet simmer of discontent. Now, in Chapter 5, we witness the moment that simmer boils over into a roar of public fury. This is the story of the people's outrage. Imagine the streets of Boston in late 1773. Crisp autumn air is unjust filled with the scent of wood smoke and sea salt. It's thick with tension. News of the Tea Act has spread like wildfire, and the city is a powder keg. This wasn't just another tax. To the people of Boston, this felt different. It felt personal. It was a direct assault, not just on their wallets, but on their fundamental rights as Englishmen. Everywhere you looked, the city was alive with defiance. Cobblestone streets, once bustling with everyday commerce, now became stages for protest. Crowds would gather spontaneously, their numbers swelling from dozens to hundreds, then thousands. Men in tricorn hats and leather aprons stood shoulder to shoulder with women in bonnets and shawls. Their faces were etched with a mixture of anger and determination. Their voices, once individual murmurs of complaint, now merged into a single, powerful chorus demanding liberty. They weren't a disorganized mob. They were a community united by a shared grievance. They were neighbors, artisans, merchants, and sailors, all convinced that their freedom was being systematically dismantled, ship by ship, tax by tax. But this outrage wasn't just confined to noisy street demonstrations. A war of words was being waged alongside the protests. Pamphlets, the social media of the 18th century, began appearing everywhere, printed in small, secretive print shops. These documents were the lifeblood of the resistance. They were passed from hand to hand in taverns, tucked into market baskets, and posted on the doors of public buildings. Writers like Samuel Adams, using powerful pseudonyms, laid out the case against the crown. They didn't just list economic complaints. They spoke of tyranny, of natural rights, and of a government that had broken its sacred trust with the people. They used simple, powerful language that resonated with everyone, from the learned lawyer to the humble dock worker. These pamphlets weren't dry legal arguments. They were passionate calls to action. They explained how the Tea Act wasn't about cheap tea, but about establishing a precedent, the right of Parliament to tax the colonies without their consent. It was a Trojan horse, they argued, designed to look like a gift, but hiding a dagger aimed at the heart of colonial self-governance. Reading these pamphlets, ordinary people began to connect the dots, seeing the Tea Act not as an isolated issue, but as the latest move in a deliberate campaign to subjugate them. The epicenter of this intellectual and political earthquake was the town meeting. Faneuil Hall, a building gifted to the city as a place for open debate, could no longer contain the crowds. The meetings had to be moved to the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in Boston, and even its pews and galleries were packed to overflowing. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The air crackled with passionate oratory. One after another, speakers would rise to condemn the Tea Act. Men like John Hancock, one of the wealthiest merchants in the colonies, stood before his fellow citizens and risked his entire fortune by denouncing the king's policies. Their speeches were filled with righteous anger, echoing from the rafters and stirring the souls of everyone present. They debated resolutions, drafted petitions, and strategized their next moves. These weren't secret meetings of a small cabal of conspirators. They were open public gatherings where the will of the people was being forged in the fire of debate. This was democracy in its rawest, most potent form. The town meetings gave a voice to the voiceless and a structure to the outrage. They transformed the scattered anger of individuals into the unified, organized resistance of a community. It was here, in these crowded, impassioned meetings, that the abstract idea of no taxation without representation became a concrete, non-negotiable demand. What's truly remarkable is how this sentiment transcended class and occupation. It wasn't just the radicals or the intellectuals who were incensed. It was everyone. The merchant, who saw his business threatened by the East India Company's government-sponsored monopoly, was angry. The shopkeeper, who felt the sting of British economic policy, was angry. But just as importantly, the average man and woman, the carpenter, the blacksmith, the seamstress, they might not have understood all the legal complexities, but they understood the core principle. They understood injustice. They saw the arrival of the tea ships not as a commercial event, but as a challenge. It was a test of their resolve. Would they bow to a distant, unaccountable power, or would they stand up for the principle of self-government they believed to be their birthright? For them, the Tea Act was the final straw. It crystallized years of simmering resentment into a single, unshakable conviction. Their freedom was under attack, and they had to defend it. This wasn't about economics anymore. It was about identity. It was about who they were, and what kind of future they would build for their children. This groundswell of popular outrage set the stage for the dramatic events to come. The people had spoken, not with one voice, but with thousands, all singing the same song of liberty. The protests, the pamphlets, and the town meetings had transformed Boston. The city was united, organized, and resolute. They had drawn a line in the sand. The question now was, what would happen when the Crown tried to cross it? The arrival of the tea ships was imminent, and with them came a choice: submission or defiance. The people of Boston, fueled by their outrage, had already made their decision. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story is escalating, and the stakes are getting higher. If you're finding this journey into the past as fascinating as I am, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue to bring these pivotal moments in history to life. Join us next time as we witness the direct consequence of this popular outrage in an event that would change the course of history forever. We'll see you then. In the bustling cobblestone streets of colonial Boston, a storm was brewing. Not a storm of wind and rain, but one of defiance, whispered in the flickering candlelight of taverns and secret back rooms. A new chapter in America's story was about to be written, not by kings or generals, but by ordinary men who dared to call themselves patriots. This is the story of Chapter 6. The Sons of Liberty gather. As British authority tightened its grip, a clandestine brotherhood began to form. They were merchants, artisans, lawyers, and laborsmen from all walks of life, united by a single, burning idea: liberty. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty, a name that would soon echo from the docks of Boston to the halls of Parliament in London. Who were these men? They weren't just angry colonists. They were masters of organization and propaganda. Think of them as the original grassroots movement, using every tool at their disposal to challenge an empire. They were determined, clever, and absolutely fearless. Their leader, a man named Samuel Adams, was a political firebrand with a genius for mobilizing public opinion. He wasn't the famous brewer you might be thinking of. That was his cousin, John Adams. No, Samuel Adams was a master of political theater, a man who understood that a single, powerful symbol could be more potent than 1,000 muskets. Their meeting places were the heart of colonial social life. Taverns like the Green Dragon, often called the headquarters of the Revolution. Imagine the scene. The air thick with the smell of wood smoke and ale. Men huddled around rough-hewn tables, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the fire. Here, they weren't just sharing a drink. They were sharing secrets. They were plotting, planning, and strategizing. Each murmur, each nod, was a small act of rebellion. They used codes, secret handshakes, and a network of messengers to spread their message of resistance throughout the colonies. Their primary target, the Tea Act of 1773. To the British, it was a simple economic policy designed to bail out the struggling East India Company. But to the Sons of Liberty, it was the ultimate symbol of taxation without representation. It wasn't about the price of tea. It was about the principle. They saw the act as a Trojan horse, a clever trick to make the colonists accept Parliament's right to tax them. And so, they made a solemn vow. In those secret meetings, they raised their glasses not in a toast to the king, but in a pledge to each other. They swore an oath that the British tea, languishing in the holds of ships in Boston Harbor, would never touch the shores of their city. It would not be unloaded. It would not be sold. It would not be consumed. Their methods were bold and theatrical. They organized public protests, printed fiery pamphlets, and used newspapers to spread their anti-tax message. They erected liberty trees and liberty poles as powerful, visible symbols of their cause, rallying points for public dissent. They weren't afraid to get their hands dirty, either. They organized boycotts of British goods, convincing thousands of their fellow colonists to make sacrifices for the greater cause of freedom. They understood that economic pressure was a powerful weapon, but their greatest performance was yet to come. As the tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, sat anchored in the harbor, the tension in Boston was palpable. The royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was determined that the tea would be unloaded and the tax paid. The Sons of Liberty were just as determined that it would not. It was a standoff, a high-stakes game of political chicken. The Sons of Liberty held massive town meetings, gathering thousands of citizens at the Old South Meeting House. The energy was electric. Speeches were given, resolutions were passed, and the crowd grew more and more resolute with each passing hour. They sent delegations to the governor, pleading with him to send the ships back to England. Each time, he refused. With every refusal, the resolve of the Sons of Liberty hardened. Their secret tavern talks turned from planning protests to planning direct action. They weren't just talking about resistance anymore. They were preparing to ignite a spark that would light the fires of revolution. They had vowed that the tea would never land. The deadline for paying the tax was fast approaching. The time for words was running out, and the time for action was at hand. The stage was set for one of the most iconic acts of defiance in American history, an event that would show the world that the Sons of Liberty were not just a group of agitators, but a force to be reckoned with. The fate of the tea, and perhaps the fate of the colonies themselves, hung in the balance. Thank you so much for watching this chapter of our story. If you're enjoying this journey through history, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue to bring these incredible stories to life. We'll see you in the next chapter. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into Chapter 7, the arrival of the tea ships. If you've been following along, you know the tension in Boston has been simmering for years. The colonists feel unheard, their rights ignored by a distant parliament. The Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre. Each event has added another layer of resentment. And now, the Tea Act of 1773 has pushed things to a boiling point. It's not just about tea. It's about a principle. No taxation without representation. The colonists see this act as a sly maneuver by Britain to assert its authority and force them to accept Parliament's right to tax them. The Sons of Liberty, led by firebrands like Samuel Adams, have been organizing, protesting, and making it clear that they will not allow this tax tea to be sold in their city. The stage is set for a confrontation, and all of Boston is holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. And then, on a crisp, late November day in 1773, the first ship appears on the horizon. It's the Dartmouth, a vessel owned by the Roch family of Nantucket, but its cargo is what matters. In it sold Are 114 Chesapeake East India Company tea. As it glides into Boston Harbor and moors at Griffin's Wharf, it's not just a merchant ship. It's a floating symbol of British policy, a direct challenge to the will of the people. The arrival of the Dartmouth sends a shockwave through the city. The law is clear. Customs duties must be paid within 20 days, or the cargo will be seized by customs officials and sold at auction. For the Patriots, this is a nightmare scenario. If the tea is seized and sold, the tax will be paid, and the principle they've fought so hard for will be lost. The clock has officially started ticking. The Sons of Liberty waste no time. Meetings are held immediately, filling the Old South Meeting House to overflowing. Thousands of citizens from Boston and surrounding towns pour in, their voices united in a single cry. The tea must not land. They demand that Francis Roch, the young owner of the Dartmouth, send his ship and its controversial cargo back to England. Roch is caught in an impossible position. On one side, he has thousands of angry colonists threatening his property and perhaps his safety. On the other, he has Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a staunch loyalist, who is equally determined that the tea will be unloaded and the law upheld. Hutchinson refuses to grant the Dartmouth the necessary clearance papers to leave the harbor without first paying the duties. He even has British warships, the HMS Active and the HMS Kingfisher, guarding the harbor entrance, ready to fire on any ship that tries to leave without permission. Roch is trapped between a rock and a hard place, a pawn in a much larger political game. As the days tick by, the tension in the city becomes almost unbearable. The first 20-day deadline for the Dartmouth is fast approaching. And then, the situation gets even more complicated. Two more ships arrive, the Eleanor and the Beaver, also laden with East India Company tea. Now, there are 3 ships at Griffin's Wharf, a floating trio of defiance. The Eleanor docks right beside the Dartmouth, and a few days later, the Beaver joins them. Though it's initially quarantined in the outer harbor due to a reported case of smallpox, once cleared, It too is brought to the wharf. The total amount of tea now sitting in the harbor is staggering over 340 chests. A massive quantity of goods, representing a significant financial investment for the East India Company and a huge political symbol for both sides. The presence of 3 ships escalates the crisis exponentially. It's no longer about a single vessel. It's a full-blown blockade of British policy, orchestrated by the people of Boston. The city is a whirlwind of activity. The Sons of Liberty post armed guards at the wharf around the clock to ensure not a single chest of tea is secretly unloaded. These are not soldiers, but ordinary citizens, carpenters, blacksmiths, printers, taking shifts to watch over the ships. It's a powerful display of communal resolve. Day and night, they patrol the docks, a visible deterrent to Governor Hutchinson and the customs officials. Imagine the scene. The creak of the ships, the lapping of the water against the hulls, the low murmur of conversations from the guards, all under the watchful eyes of a city on edge. Every new day brings a fresh wave of anxiety. Will today be the day the governor makes his move? Will the ship owners cave? The deadline looms, and every tick of the clock sounds like a drumbeat, counting down to a confrontation that feels both inevitable and terrifying. Throughout this period, Samuel Adams is the master strategist, the puppet master, pulling the strings behind the scenes. He is a brilliant organizer and propagandist, using town meetings and the press to keep the patriotic fervor at a fever pitch. He understands that this is a battle for public opinion, as much as it is a legal and political standoff. He ensures that the narrative remains focused on liberty and the tyranny of taxation. Adams and other leaders like John Hancock and Joseph Warren are in constant communication, planning their next move. They orchestrate massive public meetings, drawing thousands to Faneuil Hall and then to the larger Old South Meeting House. These gatherings are not just for show. They are a form of direct democracy, where the collective will of the people is voiced and solidified. It is here that resolutions are passed, and the demand is made, again and again, send the ships back. It is this relentless public pressure, expertly channeled by Adams, that creates the unified front against Governor Hutchinson. Meanwhile, Governor Thomas Hutchinson remains resolute, almost stubborn, in his position, a native-born Massachusetts man. He is nevertheless a firm supporter of royal authority. He believes that yielding to the colonists will only encourage more lawlessness and weaken the position of the crown. From his perspective, the law must be enforced, and the sovereignty of Parliament must be maintained. He refuses all pleas to allow the ships to depart. He believes that if he can just hold out until the 20-day deadline, the law will take its course. The customs officials will seize the tea, and the crisis will be resolved in the government's favor. Hutchinson's refusal to compromise, to find a political solution, effectively closes all doors for a peaceful resolution. He sees the conflict in black and white terms: order versus chaos, law versus mob rule. And he is determined that law and order will prevail. This intransigence will have consequences he could never have imagined. So, let's recap the situation as we approach the final day. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, are tied up at Griffin's Wharf, holding nearly 92,000 pounds of tea. The legal deadline for the Dartmouth to pay its duties is December 16th. If the duties aren't paid, the tea will be seized by customs officials. The people, organized by the Sons of Liberty, have made it clear they will not allow the tea to be landed or the tax to be paid. What'll happen on December 16th? The colonists are out of legal options. The governor will not back down. The deadline is absolute. This is the moment of truth. The arrival of the tea ships wasn't the beginning of the conflict, but it was the catalyst for the explosive event that would follow. Join us next time as we witness the dramatic climax to this standoff at Griffin's Wharf. Thank you so much for watching and for being a part of this historical exploration. Your curiosity and engagement make this all worthwhile. If you enjoyed this video and want to see what happens next, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Last time, we saw the Dartmouth sail into Boston Harbor, its controversial cargo of tea setting the stage for a major confrontation. Today, in Chapter 8, we dive into the immense pressure cooker that was Governor Thomas Hutchinson's office. Imagine being in his shoes. Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, was a man caught between a rock and a hard place. On one side, he had the full weight of the British crown and the law breathing down his neck. On the other, he faced thousands of angry, determined colonists who were absolutely refusing to back down. The situation was a powder keg, and Hutchinson was holding the match. The law was crystal clear, at least from the British perspective. Once a ship entered the harbor, it had 20 days to unload its cargo. After that, customs officials were legally required to seize the goods and sell them at auction to pay the duties. For the Dartmouth, the clock started ticking the moment it dropped anchor. The deadline was fast approaching. If the tea wasn't unloaded, it would be seized. If it was unloaded, the tax would be collected. Either way, the colonists' boycott would be broken, and the principle of no taxation without representation would be defeated. The Sons of Liberty and the people of Boston knew this. They weren't just protesting, they were playing a high-stakes game of political chess. Their demand was simple. Send the ships back to England, tea and all. They didn't want the tea landed, they didn't want it stored, and they certainly didn't want it sold. They wanted it gone. So, the ship's owner, Francis Roch, a young and overwhelmed merchant, found himself becoming a reluctant pawn. He was pressured by the colonists to request clearance from the customs officials to leave the port without unloading the tea. But the customs men, loyal to the crown, refused. Their hands were tied by the Lond, likely by Governor Hutchinson himself, who was determined to enforce British authority. This is where Hutchinson's dilemma truly sharpens. He saw the colonists' actions as a direct challenge to the rule of law and the power of Parliament. He was a staunch loyalist, a man who believed in order and the supremacy of the British government. Allowing the ships to return to England without paying the tax would be a massive concession. It would signal weakness. It would, in his eyes, be a surrender to mob rule. He couldn't let that happen. So, he made his decision. He refused to issue the special pass that would allow the ships to sail past the castle, the British fort guarding the entrance to the harbor. His order was firm. The ships would stay. The tea would be unloaded. The law would be obeyed. He doubled down, believing he was upholding his duty to the king. But the people of Boston had a different interpretation of duty. They felt a duty to their rights as Englishmen, a duty to their future liberty. They gathered in massive town meetings, thousands strong, at the Old South Meeting House. The atmosphere was electric. Speaker after speaker condemned the governor's refusal. They saw it not as upholding the law, but as an act of tyranny. Day after day, the tension mounted. The deadline for the Dartmouth was midnight, December 16th. Everyone in Boston knew the date. It was a ticking time bomb. The colonists sent Roch back and forth, making one final, desperate appeal to the governor. Could he not see the chaos he was about to unleash? Could he not bend justis onse for the sake of peace? Hutchinson was at his country estate in Milton, just outside Boston, trying to distance himself from the city's turmoil, but there was no escape. Roch made the final journey, pleading his case. Hutchinson listened, but his mind was made up. He saw any compromise as a fatal blow to royal authority in the colonies. His answer was a final, resounding no. The law must take its course. When Roch returned to the Old South Meeting House that evening, the building was packed to the rafters, with thousands more standing outside in the cold December air. He delivered the governor's final refusal. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. The talking was over. All legal and peaceful avenues had been exhausted. Then, Samuel Adams, one of the key leaders of the Sons of Liberty, stood up. The historical accounts say he announced, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." This wasn't a declaration of defeat. It was a signal. It was the code word the activists had been waiting for. As soon as he uttered those words, a series of loud whoops and war cries erupted from the back of the meeting house. It was a sound that would echo through history. Governor Hutchinson, in his rigid adherence to the law, had completely misjudged the colonists' resolve. He believed they would protest, they would shout, but in the end, they would submit to the authority of the Crown and the guns of the British Navy. He thought he was choosing order over chaos. Instead, his refusal to compromise lit the fuse for one of the most iconic acts of defiance in American history. He had closed every door, except one, and the colonists were about to burst right through it. What happened next would become legendary. The war cries at the Old South Meeting House were the starting gun for the Boston Tea Party. Governor Hutchinson, Esse dilemma, had reached its explosive conclusion. By refusing to let the ships go, he had sealed the fate of their cargo. Join us next time as we storm the docks alongside the Sons of Liberty and witness the night the tea was finally unloaded straight into Boston Harbor. It's an event you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching. If you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We love having you here as we explore these pivotal moments in history. See you next time. Hello, history lovers, and welcome back to our channel. When we last left Boston, the Dartmouth had just sailed into the harbor, its belly full of East India Company tea. The fuse had been lit. Now, in Chapter 9, we watch as that fuse burns shorter and shorter, and the entire city holds its collective breath. The arrival of the Dartmouth wasn't a singular event. It was the start of a countdown. Every Bostonian knew the law. Customs duties had to be paid within 20 days, or the cargo would be seized by the authorities. The clock started ticking the moment the ship anchored. November 28th, 1773. 20 days. That put the deadline squarely on December 17th. The whole city was watching, waiting. What would happen when time ran out? Almost immediately, the docks became the city as a focal point. It wasn't just sailors and merchants anymore. Day after day, crowds began to gather. Shopkeepers left their counters, artisans put down their tools, and apprentices snuck away from their masters. They stood in clusters, their faces etched with a mixture of anxiety, and defiance, their eyes fixed on the Dartmouth and the two ships that soon joined it, the Eleanor and the Beaver. These weren't just ships. They were symbols of Parliament's arrogance, floating fortresses of a policy that Boston refused to accept. The air crackled with hushed conversations, rumors spreading like wildfire. Did you hear what Sam Adams said? Will the governor finally relent? What are the Sons of Liberty planning? The tension was a physical presence, a thick fog of uncertainty that clung to the waterfront. While the common folk gathered at the harbor, the leaders of the resistance were organizing. The heart of the debate, the very epicenter of Boston's revolutionary fervor, was the Old South Meeting House. This wasn't some backroom tavern meeting. This was a mass mobilization. Faneuil Hall, the usual meeting spot, was quickly overwhelmed. Thousands of people, literally thousands, from every walk of life poured into the cavernous space of Old South. It was standing room only, with people spilling out into the streets, straining to hear the passionate speeches echoing from within. Inside, the air was electric. Men like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Joseph Warren stood before the packed assembly, their voices ringing with passion and purpose. The question on everyone's lips was simple, yet monumental. What do we do now? The debates were long and intense. Every option was on the table. Could they convince Governor Hutchinson to send the ships back to England? Tea and all? Could they persuade the ship's owner, Francis Roach, to defy the customs officials? Each proposal was met with thunderous applause or vehement disagreement. These weren't just political discussions. They were moments of profound civic engagement, where ordinary people felt the weight of history being forged by their own voices and their own decisions. But with each passing day, the hope for a peaceful resolution dwindled. Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained inflexible. From his country estate in Milton, he refused to budge. He was a man caught between a rock and a hard place, loyal to the crown, yet governing a populace on the verge of open rebellion. He issued proclamations ordering the meetings to disperse, but his words were ignored. His authority was crumbling. He believed the law was the law, and the tea tax must be paid. He ordered Admiral Montague's warships to blockade the harbor, ensuring that the tea ships couldn't leave without paying the duty. The net was tightening. The owner of the Dartmouth, a young Quaker merchant named Francis Roach, was in an impossible position. He was summoned repeatedly to the meetings at Old South. The Patriots pressured him to send his ship back to London, but he knew that attempting to leave the harbor without clearance from the customs office was illegal. His ship and its entire cargo, not just the tea, could be confiscated. Even worse, He could face financial ruin and legal prosecution. The crowd would roar with impatience, but Roch could only plead his case. He was trapped between the will of the people and the unyielding power of the British Empire. Meanwhile, the Sons of Liberty were not just debating. Behind the scenes, they were planning. They were masters of organization and propaganda. They established a 25-man guard to watch the tea ships day and night, ostensibly to prevent the tea from being unloaded secretly, but also to ensure the cargo remained right where they wanted it. This guard was a constant, visible reminder of the Patriots' control over the situation. They were sending a clear message to Hutchinson and the Crown. This tea will not land. As the days turned into the first and then the second week of December, the mood in the city grew heavier. Every sunrise brought the deadline one day closer. The initial excitement of defiance was slowly being replaced by a grim determination. People went about their daily business, but the tea was the only thing anyone was really talking about. It was a topic of conversation in every tavern, every workshop, and at every dinner table. The city was a powder keg, and everyone was just waiting for the spark. They were on a collision course with the Crown, and no one knew what the crash would look like, but they knew it was coming. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the final act was about to begin. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back in time. The story is reaching its climax, and you won't want to miss what happens next. If you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion. We'll see you in the next chapter. It's the dead of winter in Boston, December 16th, 1773. The air is thick, not just with a biting cold off the Atlantic, but with a tension that has been brewing for months, even years. Thousands of colonists, a significant portion of Boston's entire population, are packed into the Old South Meeting House. They've been debating for hours, their voices rising and falling like the tide, all focused on 3 ships moored in the harbor: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. These aren't just any ships. They are carriers of a cargo that has become a symbol of everything. The colonists resent taxation without representation. They carry tea from the British East India Company. For weeks, Boston has been in a standoff. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a staunch loyalist, is adamant. The tea will be unloaded, and the tax, the despised townshend duty, will be paid. The colonists, led by a group known as the Sons of Liberty, are just as adamant. The tea will not land. They've tried everything. They've pleaded. They've negotiated. They've sent emissaries to the governor, begging him to allow the ships to sail back to England with their cargo untouched. But every appeal has been met with a firm no. The deadline is looming. By midnight, if the tax isn't paid, customs officials will legally seize the cargo, unload it themselves under the protection of British authority, and the colonists' protests will have failed. The atmosphere in the meeting house is electric. People are frustrated, angry, and feeling cornered. All eyes turn to one man, a figure who has been a constant, unwavering voice for colonial rights. Samuel Adams. He's not a fiery, young orator like some of his contemporaries. He's in his 50s, a man whose political career has been a long, slow burn, building networks, writing articles, and organizing resistance behind the scenes. But tonight, his words will ignite a firestorm. As the final messenger returns with the governor as ultimate refusal, a wave of despair and fury washes over the crowd. What more can they do? They've exhausted every peaceful, legal option available to them. It feels like a dead end. Samuel Adams reases. He isn't shouting. His voice is clear, steady, and filled with a somber gravity that cuts through the noise. He lets the silence hang for a moment. Then he makes a declaration that will echo through history. He says, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." It sounds like a statement of defeat, a surrender. But to the ears of the initiated, the Sons of Liberty scattered throughout the crowd, it's anything but. It is the signal, the prearranged code. The moment legal debate ends and direct action begins. This meeting can do nothing more ... Double quotes the words are a release. A green light for a plan that has been carefully and secretly orchestrated. Suddenly, war whoops and cries erupt from the gallery and the doorways. It's a startling, theatrical sound. Dozens of men disguised as Mohawk warriors, a symbol to show they were not British subjects, but something new. Something American began to emerge. This isn't a spontaneous riot. It's a disciplined, organized operation. They brandish hatchets and axes, their faces smeared with soot and paint, not just as a disguise, but as a commitment to the radical act they are about to undertake. The crowd spills out of the Old South Meeting House, a river of people flowing towards Griffin's Wharf. Many are spectators, swept up in the historic moment, while the core group of Mohawks, about 150 strong, marches with purpose. They are organized into 3 parties, one for each of the T-ships. The night is surprisingly quiet, punctuated only by the splintering of wood and the hushed orders of the leaders. There's no looting, no chaos. In fact, when one man is caught trying to stuff his pockets with tea, he is stripped of his coat and kicked out of the procession. This is not about theft. It's about a principle. The men board the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. They demand the keys to the cargo holds from the ship captains, who offer no resistance. For the next 3 hours, they work with a remarkable efficiency. Chest after heavy chest of T-342 of them in totalies hoisted from the holds. The men smash them open with their axes and dump the contents over the side into the frigid waters of Boston Harbor. The tide is low, and the tea piles up in the shallow water, forming small, fragrant mountains. Some of the men even wade into the muck to break up the clumps, ensuring every last leaf is ruined, soaked by the salty brine. Imagine the scene. The moonlight reflecting off the water, the dark shapes of the ships, the determined figures working silently, the only sounds being the chop of the axes and the splash of tea. The sheer scale of it is staggering. Over 92,000 pounds of tea, valued at nearly $1 million in today's money, are destroyed. It is an act of defiance on a scale never before seen in the American colonies. It is a direct assault on private property and a bold, unmistakable challenge to the authority of the British Crown and Parliament. As the last chest is thrown overboard, the men quietly disperse, melting back into the city, shedding their disguises and becoming simple tradesmen, craftsmen, and merchants once again. They have crossed a line. There is no going back. The Boston Tea Party, as it would come to be known, was not just a protest over a tax. It was a fateful decision, a declaration that words were no longer enough. The actions taken on that cold December night would set in motion a chain of events that would lead directly to the clash of arms at Lexington and ultimately, to the birth of a new nation. The quiet splash of tea in Boston Harbor was, in reality, the first loud shot of the American Revolution. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the pivotal moments that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next video. The air bites with the sharp frost of a Boston winter. December 16th, 1773. As dusk settles over the cobblestone streets, a strange and resolute procession begins. Figures emerge from the shadows, not as the familiar shopkeepers, artisans, and laborers of the city, but as something else entirely. Their faces are streaked with soot and red ochre. Blankets are draped over their shoulders, and their heads are adorned with feathers. They are disguised as Mohawk warriors, a symbol of a free, untamed America. A stark contrast to the rigid authority of the British Crown they are about to defy. This is not a random mob. There's a quiet, disciplined energy humming through their ranks. They gather in small groups, whispering final instructions, their breath pluming in the frigid air. You can see the determination in their eyes, a glint of defiance that cuts through the dim light of the gas lamps. Their goal is singular and specific. A message to be sent across the Atlantic. A message that will echo through the halls of Parliament. They are marching towards Griffin's Wharf, where 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lie tethered, their holds laden with a cargo that has become a symbol of oppression. Tea from the British East India Company. As they move through the winding streets, the column swells. More men, similarly disguised, join the ranks. They carry hatchets and axes, not as weapons of war against people, but as tools for a very particular task. An order has been passed down, a code of conduct for the night's work, and it is absolute. No harm is to come to any person. The sailors on the ships, the customs officials, even the Tory sympathizers are not their targets. Their fight is not with individuals, but with the idea of taxation without representation. The destruction must be clean, focused, and symbolic. Any violence against a person would taint their cause, turning a political protest into a simple riot. The leaders of this group, men like Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, understood this perfectly. The world was watching, and the integrity of their rebellion depended on their discipline this night. The crowd that follows them is a mix of hushed anticipation and nervous excitement. Thousands of Bostonians line the streets, their faces illuminated by the flickering torches of the marchers. They are silent observers, witnesses to this audacious act. They understand the stakes. This isn't just about tea. It's about liberty. It's about drawing a line in the sand, declaring that they will not be governed by a distant power that ignores their rights as Englishmen. The disguises serve a dual purpose. They provide anonymity, protecting the participants from arrest and prosecution. But more importantly, they are a powerful piece of political theater. By dressing as Native Americans, the colonists are claiming a new identity, one that is distinctly American, separate from their British heritage. They are saying, "We are of this land, and we will not be ruled by an empire across the sea." Reaching the wharf, the disciplined groups split off, assigned to each of the 3 ships. They move with a surprising efficiency, clambering aboard with a quiet resolve. The ship crews, massively outnumbered and likely sympathetic to the cause, offer no resistance. The night is filled with a new sound, not of shouting or fighting, but of splintering wood. The men hoist the heavy tea chests from the holds, their muscles straining in the cold. With swift, powerful swings of their hatchets, they break open the crates. The air, once sharp with the scent of salt and winter, is now thick with the fragrant, exotic aroma of tea. Chest after chest is heaved over the rails, splashing into the dark, icy waters of the harbor. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of men working in near silence under the moonlight, the only sounds being the rhythmic chop of axes and the splash of crates hitting the water. It's a methodical, almost surgical, destruction. One participant, Joshua Wyeth, would later recall how they were so careful that when a padlock belonging to one of the ship's captains was broken, the protesters stopped, found the captain, and replaced it the very next day. This wasn't about looting or vandalism. It was a principled stand. They were destroying the king's property, the company's property, to make a point that could not be ignored. They were destroying the physical manifestation of the Tea Act. For 3 hours, this continues. The tide begins to ebb, and the piles of tea chests grow so high in the shallow water that they threaten to spill back onto the decks. The men have to wade into the freezing harbor to push the chests further out and break them apart, ensuring every last leaf is soaked by the salt water, ruined and unsalvageable. Over 340 chests of tea, the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's money, are dumped into Boston Harbor. It is a staggering financial blow to the East India Company and a direct challenge to the authority of the British government. As the work is done, the disguised men melt back into the city as quietly as they came. They discard their feathers and wash the soot from their faces, becoming ordinary citizens once more. Boston awakens the next morning to a harbor stained brown with tea and a political landscape forever changed. News of the Boston Tea Party, as it would come to be known, spreads like wildfire throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic. It is an act of defiance so bold, so audacious, that it cannot be ignored. The British response would be swift and harsh, with the implementation of the Intolerable Acts, pushing the colonies ever closer to the brink of all-out war. But on this cold winter night, as the last of the protesters slips away, there is a sense of accomplishment. They had gathered in the darkness, cloaked in disguise, and performed an act that would illuminate the path to revolution. They destroyed tea, not to cause chaos, but to defend a principle. And in doing so, they brewed a storm that would eventually lead to the birth of a new nation. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the pivotal moments of history. We've got so much more to explore together. See you in the next video. All right, gather round, history lovers, and let's pull back the curtain on one of the most iconic nights in American history. We're diving deep into Chapter 12. Into the harbor. Picture this. The moon hangs low over Boston, casting a silvery glow on the still, dark waters. The air is thick with tension, a silence so profound you could almost hear a pin drop. This isn't just any night. It's a night that will forever be etched into the soul of a nation. On T-docks, shadows move with purpose. These aren't random troublemakers. They are ordinary men craftsmen, merchants, apprentices united by a fiery passion for liberty. Their faces are grim, their resolve firm. They've spent weeks, months, even years, feeling the tightening grip of a distant king and a parliament that doesn't hear them. They've petitioned, they've protested, they've pleaded, but every appeal has been met with indifference. Every cry for fairness answered with another tax, another restriction. The Tea Act was the final straw, a symbol of everything they were fighting against. Taxation without representation. So, tonight, words are not enough. Tonight, they act. Under the cloak of darkness, they begin to gather, their movements quiet and deliberate. There's a shared understanding, a silent pact among them. They aren't just a mob. They are an organized force, the Sons of Liberty, and they have a plan. The target isn't the sailors or the ships themselves. It's the cargo. It's the tea, the very symbol of British oppression. They move in small groups, slipping through the darkened streets of Boston, converging on Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver lie, anchored their bellies, full of the controversial cargo. As they reach the wharf, a transformation takes place. To conceal their identities, many have donned disguises. They've smeared their faces with soot and red ochre and wrapped blankets around their shoulders, a rough approximation of Mohawk warrior attire. This wasn't to blame the Native Americans. Far from Italiano, it was a powerful symbol. In the colonial mind, the Mohawk represented a spirit of freedom, an identity that was purely American, untethered to the old world of Europe. By adopting this guise, they were declaring themselves not as British subjects, but as something new, something independent as Americans. With leaders like Samuel Adams giving the signal, the groups divide and prepare to board. The ship's crews, caught completely by surprise, offer little resistance. In fact, many are sympathetic to the colonists' cause. The Sons of Liberty are disciplined. They assure the captains that no harm will come to them or their private property. Their mission is precise and focused. The only target is the tea. The men swarm up the sides of the ships, their feet thudding softly on the wooden decks. The quiet of the harbor is about to be broken. Once aboard, they work with a surprising efficiency. The leaders shout orders, organizing the men into teams. They pry open the ship's holds, revealing the treasure trove within. Hundreds upon hundreds of heavy wooden chests, each packed tight with tea from the British East India Company. This isn't just a simple act of vandalism. It's a highly coordinated operation. The chests, each weighing nearly 400 pounds, are hoisted from the dark holds onto the moonlit decks. The air fills with the splintering sound of wood as axes and hatchets are brought down, splitting the chests wide open. And then it begins. The first chest is heaved over the railing, its contents tumbling out in a dark cascade, hitting the water with a soft splash that echoes across the harbor. The air, once crisp with the scent of salt water, now begins to fill with the fragrant aroma of dry tea leaves. One by one, then dozen by dozen, the chests follow. It's a relentless, rhythmic process. Hoist, break, and dump. Men are sweating, their muscles straining, but they don't stop. They are fueled by a sense of purpose, a righteous anger that has been simmering for far too long. Imagine the scene from the shore. Bostonians, drawn by the commotion, watch in a mixture of awe and disbelief. They see the shadowy figures on the ships, working tirelessly under the moon. They hear the steady crack of axes and the splash of tea hitting the water. This is not a riot, it's a ceremony. It's a bold, defiant, political statement being made for the whole world to see. They are not just destroying property. They are destroying a symbol of their subjugation. Every chest of tea that plunges into the harbor is a message to King George III. We will not be controlled. The work continues for 3 long hours. The tide begins to turn, and the tea leaves, floating on the surface, start to form vast, dark mats that drift in and out with the current. The sheer scale of it is staggering. In total, 342 chests of tea are destroyed. That's more than 90,000 pounds of tea, a fortune in today's money, all sent to the bottom of Boston Harbor. The financial blow to the British East India Company would be immense, but the political impact would be immeasurable. As the last chest is sent overboard, a sense of finality settles over the men. Their work is done. But this is not a moment of wild celebration. Their actions were born of desperation, not joy. They are disciplined to the very end. One man was caught trying to stuff his pockets with tea, and he was immediately stripped of his coat and kicked off the ship in disgrace. This was about principle, not personal gain. They even sweep the decks clean before they depart. A final gesture to show that their fight was with the crown, not with the ship owners or the crew. Silently, just as they came, the men disembark and melt back into the city's streets, their disguises discarded. They return to their homes, to their families, as printers, blacksmiths, and doctors. The events of the night, a shared, dangerous secret. Boston Harbor is quiet once more, but everything has changed. The water is stained with tea, and the path to revolution has been irrevocably set. The Boston Tea Party, as it would come to be known, was a point of no return. It was an act of defiance so audacious that it would provoke a furious response from Britain, leading to the intolerable acts and, ultimately, the first shots of the American Revolutionary War. And so, as the sun rose over Boston the next morning, it illuminated a harbor filled with ruined tea and a city filled with a new, unshakable resolve. The quiet protest had ended, and a revolution was about to begin. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what piece of history you'd like to explore next. Until then, stay curious. The night before, a low murmur had swept through the town of Harmony, a current of shared purpose that needed no grand pronouncements. It was a feeling, a collective breath held in anticipation. As dawn broke, casting long, soft shadows across the cobblestones, the town square began to fill. But this was no ordinary gathering. There were no shouts, no banners, no fists raised in anger. There was only a quiet, determined procession of people, each carrying a simple wooden chair and a small tea set. One by one, they set down their chairs, facing the imposing granite facade of the magistrate's hall. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle clinking of porcelain and the soft scrape of wood on stone. An old baker, his hands still dusted with flour, sat beside a young seamstress. A stonemason, his knuckles calloused, sat across from a teacher, her gaze steady. They came from every corner of the town, every walk of life, united in a singular, unspoken agreement. Then, the ritual began. Steam began to rise in the cool morning air as they poured hot water from their flasks into their teapots. The fragrant aroma of chamomile, mint, and Earl Grey mingled, creating a strange, calming perfume that filled the square. Each person performed the same delicate ceremony, steeping the leaves, pouring the tea into a small cup, and taking a slow, deliberate sip. Their movements were synchronized, not by command, but by a shared, intuitive rhythm. It was a symphony of silence, a protest painted in the gentle hues of brewing tea. The magistrate, a man named Alistair Finch, watched from his high-windowed office. He had expected a mob. He had prepared for riots, for barricades, for the guttural roar of an angry crowd. His guards were stationed on the roof, ready for a confrontation that never came. Instead, he saw his constituents, the very people he was meant to serve, engaged in this bafflingly peaceful display. He saw Mrs. Gable, who ran the bakery, nod respectfully to Mr. Croft, the blacksmith. He saw children sitting quietly beside their parents, mimicking the solemn act of pouring tea with their own tiny sets. The protest was a masterpiece of defiance, all the more powerful for its lack of aggression. Every silent sip was a statement. Every shared glance was a declaration of unity. They weren't breaking any laws. They weren't destroying property. They were simply having tea. But in this context, in tea silence arid ritual, the act was transformed. It became a powerful symbol of their resilience, their civility in the face of injustice. They were showing the magistrate that they were a community, not a mob, that they could be disciplined, organized, and unyielding without resorting to violence. As the sun climbed higher, more people joined. The square became a sprawling, silent tea party. The guards on the roof shifted uncomfortably, their weapons feeling heavy and useless. What could they do? Disperse a peaceful assembly, arrest people for drinking tea. The absurdity of the situation began to dawn on them. The townspeople had found a loophole in the language of power. They had chosen a weapon that could not be fought. Serene, unshakable, collective silence. News of the silent protests spread. Messengers on horseback galloped out of Harmony, carrying word of the strange and beautiful rebellion. In neighboring towns, people listened with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. The stories told in hushed tones, in taverns and marketplaces. The tea-sitters of Harmony, they were called. It was a protest that didn't demand attention with noise, but commanded it with its profound stillness. Hours passed. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent. The townspeople remained. They shared their food, refilled their teapots from water barrels brought by sympathetic farmers, and continued their silent vigil. There was no leader shouting orders, no single voice directing the crowd. The leadership was collective, an unspoken understanding that flowed from person to person. They were a living tapestry of quiet resistance, each individual a thread in a pattern of immense strength. Inside the magistrate's hall, the silence was of a different kind. It was heavy, tense, and unnerving. Alistair Finch paced his office, the sight of the serene crowd outside grating on his nerves. He was a man accustomed to shouting, to giving orders, and having them obeyed. This silent refusal to engage on his terms was a form of psychological warfare he was completely unprepared for. His authority was being eroded, not by a battering ram, but by the gentle, persistent tide of their quiet determination. He had tried to ignore them, to go about his business. But how could he? The entire town square, the very heart of his domain, had been transformed into a silent testament to his failure. Every time he looked out the window, he was met with hundreds of calm, steady gazes. They weren't glaring. They weren't accusatory. They were simply watching, waiting. They were the silent witnesses to his isolation. As dusk settled, a new sound joined the gentle clinking of teacups. It was the soft, melodic hum of a single cello. One of the town's musicians had brought his instrument, and he began to play a slow, melancholic tune. The music wasn't a call to arms. It was a lament, a prayer, a shared expression of their collective heart. The notes drifted over the square, weaving through the silent crowd, adding another layer of beauty and resolve to their protest. The music said what words could not. We are here, we are together, and we will not be moved. Finally, as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Magistrate Finch could bear it no longer. The silence from the outside had become a deafening roar in his own mind. He threw open his window, the hinges groaning in protest. He intended to shout, to order them to disperse, to threaten them with arrest. But as he looked down upon the sea of faces, illuminated by the soft glow of a few scattered lanterns, the words died in his throat. He saw not a mob, but his neighbors. He saw the strength in their unity, the dignity in their restraint. He saw a community that had found a way to speak with a single, powerful voice, without uttering a single word. In that moment, Alistair Finch understood. He had lost. He had been defeated not by force, but by the quiet, unyielding power of a cup of tea. The silent witnesses had won. Thank you so much for watching. This story is a powerful reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly, sips its tea, and waits. If you were moved by this chapter, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay thoughtful. December 17th, 1773. A pale, cold dawn breaks over Boston Harbor. For those who slept through the night's commotion, The first sign that something extraordinary had happened wasn't a sound, but a smell. A pungent, earthy aroma. The scent of thousands of pounds of tea hangs heavy in the frigid air. As the sun climbs higher, it illuminates a bizarre and almost surreal scene. The normally gray-green waters of the harbor are stained a deep, murky brown, and floating on the surface, like a vast, sodden blanket, are countless tea leaves. The contents of 342 chests, the East India Company's entire shipment, now bobbing uselessly on the tide. Imagine waking up to that. You're a Bostonian, maybe a merchant whose shop is near the wharf, or a sailor preparing for the day's work. You look out your window, and the harbor has transformed. It's not just a mess, it's a statement. A silent, yet incredibly loud, declaration. The tea is ruined. Destroyed. The Mohawks of the previous night have vanished as mysteriously as they appeared, melting back into the fabric of the city. But the evidence of their work is undeniable, floating for all to see. Word spreads like wildfire. It starts with whispers among the dock workers, then it's shouted from street corners, then it's debated in taverns and coffee houses. Did you hear? Did you see the harbor? The Sons of Liberty had done it. They had actually done it. This wasn't a protest with signs and speeches. This was the destruction of nearly $1 million worth of property in today's money. An act of defiance on a scale previously unimaginable. For many colonists in Boston, there's a mix of shock, fear, and a thrilling sense of victory. They had stood their ground. They had refused to let the tax tea be landed. This wasn't just about tea. It was about the principle of no taxation without representation. It was about telling a king and a parliament an ocean away that they could not impose their will on free people. John Adams, a lawyer and a key patriot leader, was initially wary of mob action. But when he heard the news, he wrote in his diary, "This is the most magnificent movement of all. This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences. I can't but consider it as an epoch in history. An epoch in history." Adams knew, even in those first hours, that this was a turning point. But what would those consequences be? That was the question on everyone's mind. How would London react? Would they back down? Would they negotiate? Or would they punish Boston for its insolence? The mood in the city is electric. A combination of defiant pride and anxious apprehension. They've poked the bear, the mightiest empire on earth. Now, they wait for it to roar. And the story doesn't stay in Boston. Riders are dispatched almost immediately. Galloping out of the city on the muddy winter roads, they carry letters and hastily printed accounts of the night's events. The news travels south to Providence, to New York, to Philadelphia, and then further to Charleston. In each town and colony, the reaction is much the same. A stunned silence, followed by a groundswell of support. In New York and Philadelphia, where tea ships were also expected, the news from Boston emboldens them. When the ships arrive, they are simply turned away, their captains wisely choosing not to test the resolve of the local Sons of Liberty. Boston's radical act had set a precedent. But the most important journey for this news is the one eastward, across the vast and stormy Atlantic. A ship, the Haley, captained by a sympathetic man named James Scott, is quickly prepared for the voyage. It carries the official dispatches and eyewitness accounts destined for London. For 6 long weeks, as the ship battles winter gales, the British government remains blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in its American colonies. They have no idea that their attempt to save a failing corporation and assert their authority has just backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Back in America, the Boston Tea Party, as it would come to be known, becomes a powerful symbol of unity. It galvanizes the patriot cause. People who might have been on the fence, who thought the protests were going too far, now see the conflict in starker terms. It's us versus them. The colonies versus Parliament. The act of destroying the tea wasn't seen by most patriots as wanton vandalism, but as a righteous defense of their liberties. They hadn't stolen the tea for personal gain. They had destroyed it to make a political point. This distinction was crucial. Meanwhile, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, is in a state of utter fury and helplessness. His authority is being completely undermined. He writes frantic letters to London, detailing the outrage and demanding a firm response. He believes the colonists have finally crossed a line from which there is no return. And in this, he was absolutely correct. The floating tea leaves in Boston Harbor were more than just a ruined shipment of goods. They would assign that the relationship between Britain and its American colonies was broken, perhaps irreparably. The morning after the Tea Party wasn't just the start of a new day. It was the dawn of a new, more confrontational, and much more dangerous phase of the American Revolution. The path to open conflict, to war, was now clearer than ever before. The repercussions of that single night would be immense. The British response would be swift and severe. They would pass a series of laws, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, designed to punish Boston and bring it to heel. They would close the port, dissolve the local government, and flood the city with troops. But instead of crushing the rebellion, these actions would only unite the 13 colonies further. They would rally to Boston's side, sending food and supplies. They would form the First Continental Congress to coordinate a unified response. The morning after the Tea Party, as Bostonians looked out over their tea-stained harbor, they couldn't have known the exact chain of events that would follow, but they knew they had done something irreversible. They had thrown down the gauntlet, and in doing so, they had taken a giant leap on the road to independence. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the immediate aftermath of the Boston Tea Party. It's a moment that truly changed the course of history. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We have so much more of this incredible story to explore together. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Last time, we witnessed the audacious Boston Tea Party, a dramatic act of defiance that sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. Today, in Chapter 15, we're diving into the thunderous response from the British Empire, a chapter we're calling Britain's Fury. Imagine you're King George III. You wake up, have your morning tea, and then you get the news. Colonists, dressed as Native Americans, have just dumped over 300 chests of your precious tea into Boston Harbor. That's not just a protest. That's a direct, multi-million-dollar slap in the face to the Crown and the British East India Company. The king was, to put it mildly, not amused. He saw this as an act of outright rebellion, a dangerous challenge to his authority and the supremacy of Parliament, and he wasn't alone. Across the halls of Parliament in London, the mood was incandescent. The news from Boston confirmed the worst fears of many British leaders, that the American colonies were spiraling out of control. For years, they had seen the colonists as ungrateful children, benefiting from the protection of the British military, but refusing to pay their fair share for it. The boycotts, the protests, the Sons of Liberty was all seen as a pattern of escalating insubordination. But the Tea Party, that was a line crossed. Lord North, the Prime Minister, addressed Parliament with a grim determination. He declared that Britain had been too lenient, that their previous attempts at reconciliation had been mistaken for weakness. The time for gentle persuasion was over. Now was the time for a strong, decisive hand. The message had to be sent, not just to Boston, but to all 13 colonies. Defiance would not be tolerated. The Empire would strike back, and it would strike back hard. The prevailing sentiment was that Boston, the perceived hotbed of this radicalism, had to be made an example of. They needed to be punished so severely that no other colony would ever dare to contemplate such an act again. So, in early 1774, Parliament began drafting a series of punitive measures aimed directly at Massachusetts, and specifically at Boston. These weren't just new taxes or regulations. These were laws designed to crush the spirit of the colonists and dismantle their political autonomy. The colonists would come to call them the Intolerable Acts, but in Britain, they were known by a much more straightforward name: the Coercive Acts. The name itself says it all. The goal was to coerce, to force the colonists into submission. The first and most devastating of these was the Boston Port Act. This law was a swift and brutal economic blow. It ordered the complete closure of Boston Harbor to all trade, effective June 1st, 1774. Think about that for a moment. Boston was a city built on maritime trade. Its harbor was its lifeblood. Closing the port was like cutting off the oxygen supply to a living being. Ships were forbidden from loading or unloading cargo. Docks fell silent. Sailors, merchants, dock workers, artisans, thousands of people were instantly put out of work. The bustling waterfront that was the heart of the city's economy became a ghost town overnight. The law was clear. The port would remain closed until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea and compensated the officials who had suffered losses. It was economic warfare, designed to starve the city into compliance. But Parliament didn't stop there. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act. This was a direct assault on the colony's political structure. For decades, Massachusetts had enjoyed a relatively democratic system where members of the colony's upper house, the council, were elected by the lower house. This act unilaterally revoked that right. From now on, the king or his governor would appoint all council members. Furthermore, the act severely restricted town meetings, a cornerstone of New England's local democracy, allowing them to be held only once a year unless the governor gave special permission. Essentially, Parliament was stripping away the colonists' ability to govern themselves, placing power directly into the hands of a royally appointed official. It was a move to decapitate the local leadership and silence public debate. Then came the Administration of Justice Act. The colonists grimly nicknamed this the Murder Act. This law stated that if a British official were to be accused of a capital crime while performing their duties in Massachusetts, they could be moved to another colony, or even back to England, for their trial. The British argued this was to ensure a fair trial, away from a hostile Boston jury. But the colonists saw it very differently. To them, it was a get-out-of-jail-free card for British soldiers and officials. It meant a soldier could harm or even kill a colonist, and then escape local justice, knowing they would likely be acquitted by a sympathetic court back home. It felt like a license to operate with impunity. Finally, there was the Quartering Act. While not exclusively part of the coercive acts, it was passed at the same time and applied to all colonies, reinforcing the message of military occupation. This act gave colonial governors broad authority to house British soldiers in private buildings, barns, inns, and even unoccupied private homes if suitable barracks were not available. While it didn't quite mean a soldier could just kick you out of your bedroom, it did mean the military presence would become an unavoidable, and often unwelcome, part of daily life. The sight of redcoats marching through your streets and living in your community was a constant, physical reminder of London's power and displeasure. King George III and Parliament fully expected these harsh measures to work. They believed that by isolating and punishing Boston, the other colonies would be intimidated into silence. They thought the economic hardship would turn the people of Massachusetts against the radical leaders, like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. They gambled that the colonists, when faced with the full might of the British Empire, would ultimately back down. But they had fundamentally misjudged the American character and the growing sense of intercolonial identity. Instead of isolating Boston, the intolerable acts did the exact opposite. News of Boston's plight spread like wildfire through the other 12 colonies. People in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas didn't see Boston as a separate entity getting its just desserts. They saw a sister colony under attack. They saw the assault on Massachusetts' rights as a direct threat to their own. If Parliament could do this to Boston, what was to stop them from doing it to Philadelphia or Charleston next? The response was a groundswell of sympathy and solidarity. Food and supplies poured into besieged Boston from all over the continent. The other colonies recognized this, not as a local dispute, but as a fight for the rights of all British Americans. The fury of Great Britain, intended to divide and conquer, was instead forging a bond of unity among the colonies, a unity that would soon be given a name: the Continental Congress. The stage was now set for the next, even more dramatic, act in this unfolding revolution. Thank you so much for joining me today. The story is heating up, and you won't want to miss what happens next. If you're enjoying this journey through history, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we're diving into a pivotal moment, a turning point where a collection of disparate colonies began to see themselves as something more, something unified. This is the story of how a harsh punishment backfired spectacularly, forging a new identity in the crucible of defiance. Welcome to Chapter 16. The colonies unite. To set this stage, let's remember the mood in Boston in the early 1770s. Tensions with Great Britain were at a fever pitch. The Boston Tea Party had just sent a very expensive message to London, dumping thousands of pounds of tea into the harbour to protest the Tea Act. King George III and Parliament were, to put it mildly, not amused. They saw this not as a protest, but as an act of open rebellion, a direct challenge to their authority. And they decided to make an example of Their response came in the form of a series of laws known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts. In Britain, they were called the Coercive Acts, which tells you everything you need to know about their intent. The first and most famous was the Boston Port Act. On June 1st, 1774, the bustling port of Boston, the economic lifeblood of the city, was ordered shut. British warships blockaded the harbor. No goods could come in, no goods could go out, until the city paid for the destroyed tea and the king was satisfied that order had been restored. Imagine that for a moment. It's like shutting down the entire internet for a major city today. The economy ground to a halt. Sailors, dockworkers, merchants, artisans were instantly out of work. The goal was to starve Boston into submission, to isolate it and make it an object lesson for the other colonies. This is what happens when you defy the crown. The punishment didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act essentially stripped the colony of its right to sell. The colonists could no longer elect their own officials. They would be appointed by the royal governor, who was, of course, loyal to the king. Town meetings, the very heart of New England's democratic tradition, were severely restricted. They could only meet once a year, and only with the governor's permission. This was a direct assault on their political identity. Then came the Administration of Justice Act, which the colonists grimly nicknamed the Murder Act. It stated that any British official accused of a capital crime while performing their duties in Massachusetts could be sent to another colony, or even back to England, for trial. The colonists were outraged. They believed this gave British soldiers a free pass to commit crimes, knowing they would never face a jury of their peers in Massachusetts. Finally, a new Quartering Act was passed, which allowed British troops to be housed in private homes and buildings, not just barracks. The presence of a standing army was already a source of friction, but forcing colonists to house soldiers in their own homes felt like an invasion, a violation of their most basic rights as Englishmen. The British government sat back, expecting the other 12 colonies to breathe a sigh of relief that it wasn't them. They expected letters from Virginia, from Pennsylvania, from New York, saying, "Those radicals in Boston got what they deserved. We'll behave." They fundamentally misread the situation. They saw 13 separate entities, each with its own interests. They failed to see the growing bonds of shared culture, shared grievances, and a shared love of liberty. Instead of fear, the news of Boston's plight sparked a wave of sympathy and solidarity that swept through the colonies. From the farms of South Carolina to the workshops of Philadelphia, people were horrified. They didn't see Boston as a rival getting its comeuppance. They saw themselves. Tay-tot. If Parliament can do this to Boston, they can do it to us. If they can shut down their port, they can shut down ours. If they can dissolve their assembly, they can dissolve ours. The punishment, intended to isolate, began to unite. A massive relief effort was organized. It was one of the first great intercolonial acts of charity and cooperation. The town of Windham, Connecticut, sent hundreds of sheep. South Carolina shipped barrels of rice. Pennsylvania sent flour. From all corners of the continent, wagons loaded with food and supplies rolled towards the besieged city of Boston. It was a lifeline, not just of goods, but of moral support. It sent a clear message. Boston, you are not alone. This outpouring of support was a profound psychological shift. For the first time, many colonists stopped thinking of themselves primarily as Virginians, or New Yorkers, or Georgians. They began to see themselves as something larger. Americans. A shared threat had created a shared identity. Patrick Henry would soon capture the sentiment perfectly when he declared, "The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. This newfound unity quickly translated into political action. Committees of correspondence, which had been set up to share information, now buzzed with calls for a coordinated response. The cry went out for a Continental Congress, a meeting of delegates from all the colonies to decide on a common course of action. This was a radical idea. Never before had the colonies come together in this way to formally challenge British policy. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Every colony except Georgia, which was dealing with its own internal conflicts, sent delegates. Here, in Carpenter's Hall, were some of the greatest minds of the generation. John Adams from Massachusetts, George Washington and Patrick Henry from Virginia, John Jay from New York. They were lawyers, planters, and merchants. Some were radicals pushing for a complete break, while others were conservatives hoping for reconciliation. But despite their differences, they agreed on one thing. The intolerable acts were an unacceptable violation of their rights. They were not just an attack on Massachusetts. They were an attack on the liberties of all Americans. After weeks of debate, they passed a series of resolutions. They issued a declaration of rights and grievances affirming their loyalty to the king but insisting on their rights as British subjects, including the right to life, liberty, property, and, crucially, the right to not be taxed without their own consent. More importantly, they agreed on a concrete plan of economic resistance. They formed the Continental Association, which called for a complete boycott of British goods. They would not import, they would not export, and they would not consume anything from Britain until the intolerable acts were repealed. This was economic warfare. It was a powerful tool that would put immense pressure on British merchants and, hopefully, on Parliament itself. The Congress also sent a direct appeal to King George III, hoping he would intervene and see reason. But their most significant decision was perhaps their last. They agreed to meet again the following May, if their demands were not met. This was a critical step. It meant the Continental Congress wasn't a one-time event. It was becoming a de facto governing body for the United Colonies. When the delegates returned home, they carried with them a new sense of purpose and unity. London's plan to make an example of Boston had failed in the most spectacular way possible. Instead of breaking the spirit of rebellion, it had galvanized it. Instead of dividing the colonies, it had brought them together as never before. The lines of communication were open, a leadership structure was forming, and a common cause had been defined. The people of Massachusetts were no longer isolated rebels. They were patriots at the forefront of a continental struggle. And across the 13 colonies, a fundamental change had occurred. The idea of being American was no longer just a geographical description. It was now a political identity, forged in opposition to what they saw as tyranny. The stage was set for the next inevitable step. The spark of rebellion had become a flame, and that flame was now spreading, uniting the colonies in a shared destiny that would lead them down the path to revolution. Thank you so much for watching. This story of unity is a powerful reminder of how shared challenges can bring people together. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into one of the most pivotal moments in American history, a time when simmering tensions finally boiled over into open conflict. This is Chapter 17, From Protest to Revolution. Grab your seats, because things are about to get intense. So, where did we leave off? Ah yes, the colonists were growing increasingly frustrated with British rule. Taxes, lack of representation, soldiers quartered in their homes. The list of grievances was long. But one event, more than any other, would serve as the point of no return. You guessed it, the Boston Tea Party. Picture it. A chilly December night in 1773. The air in Boston is thick with defiance. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, are moored in the harbor, their holds laden with tea from the British East India Company. This isn't just any tea. This tea represents everything the colonists despise, a tax they never agreed to and a monopoly that benefits a distant corporation at their expense. The Sons of Liberty, led by figures like Samuel Adams, decide that enough is enough. Disguised as Mohawk warriors to protect their identities, a group of colonists storms the ships. It's not a riot. It's a calculated act of political protest. With determined efficiency, they hoist chest after chest of tea onto the decks, break them open with axes, and dump the contents into the icy waters of Boston Harbor. Over 92,000 pounds of tea, worth a fortune, are destroyed without a single person being harmed or any other property being damaged. The message was crystal clear. We will not be governed by tyranny. News of the Boston Tea Party spread like wildfire throughout the colonies, and the reaction was electric. Some were shocked by the destruction of property, but for many, it was a heroic act of defiance. It was a line drawn in the sand. But how did Great Britain react? With a feather duster? Not a chance. King George III and Parliament were absolutely furious. To them, this was not a protest. It was an open rebellion. Their response was swift and severe. In 1774, they passed a series of laws known collectively as the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, however, they earned a different name, the Intolerable Acts. And they truly were intolerable. The Boston Port Act closed the city's harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for, crippling its economy. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of its charter and gave the royal governor unprecedented power, effectively ending self-government. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, not in the colonies, meaning they could literally get away with murder. And the Quartering Act was expanded, forcing colonists to house British soldiers in their private homes. Did these acts crush the colonial spirit as intended? Quite the opposite. They unified the colonies in a way nothing else had before. The other colonies saw Massachusetts's plight as their own. If Britain could do this to one colony, it could do it to all of them. Food and supplies poured into Boston from across the continent. Virginia's House of Burgesses called for a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity. This unified spirit led to the First Continental Congress, which convened in Philadelphia in September 1774. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia was the only holdout gathered to formulate a collective response. They weren't calling for independence just yet. Their goal was to restore the harmony that had existed between Britain and the colonies before the recent conflicts. They sent a declaration of rights and grievances to the king and organized a massive boycott of British goods. They also agreed to meet again the following year if their demands weren't met. It was a powerful statement of colonial unity and resolve. Meanwhile, back in Massachusetts, the situation was becoming a powder keg. The royal governor, General Thomas Gay, who was also the commander of British forces in North America, was trying to enforce the Intolerable Acts. In response, colonial militias, known as the Minutemen, maimed for their ability to be ready to fight at a minute's notice and to train and stockpile weapons and gunpowder in secret. The air was thick with paranoia and anticipation. Everyone knew a clash was inevitable. It was just a matter of when and where. The breaking point came on the night of April 18, 1775. General Gage received intelligence that the colonists had a significant cache of military supplies hidden in the town of Concord. He also had orders to arrest two of the most prominent Patriot leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were believed to be hiding in Lexington, a town on the road to Cut. Gage dispatched a force of about 700 British regulars, or redcoats, on a secret nighttime march. But the Patriots' intelligence network was incredibly effective. Men like Dr. Joseph Warren saw the British troops mustering and immediately sent out two riders to warn the countryside. Paul Revere and William Dawes. You all know the famous story of Paul Revere's midnight ride. Shouting, "The regulars are coming out," he galloped through the night, his warning spreading from town to town as other riders took up the alarm. By the time the British troops reached Lexington in the early morning hours of April 19th, the element of surprise was completely lost. On Lexington Green, a small band of about 77 colonial militiamen, led by Captain John Parker, stood waiting. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, vastly outnumbered by the professional British soldiers. Parker reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." As the British commander ordered the militia to disperse, a single shot rang out. To this day, no one knows for sure who fired at the shot heard round the world. But it was all the spark that was needed. The British soldiers unleashed a volley of fire into the militia's ranks. When the smoke cleared, 8 militiamen lay dead, and 10 were wounded. The British troops cheered and marched on towards Concord, leaving the stunned and grieving town behind. The first blood of the American Revolution had been shed. When the Redcoats reached Concord, they found that the colonists had already moved most of the military supplies. Frustrated, they destroyed what little they could find, and then turned back toward Boston. But their return journey would be a nightmare. The alarm had spread throughout the countryside. Thousands of Minutemen and militia from surrounding towns had grabbed their muskets and converged on the road back to Boston. From behind stone walls, trees, and houses, they unleashed a continuous and deadly fire on the marching column of British soldiers. This wasn't the open field warfare the Redcoats were trained for. This was guerrilla warfare, and it was terrifyingly effective. The British retreat turned into a desperate, running battle that stretched for 16 miles. The Redcoats, exhausted and demoralized, suffered heavy casualties. They were only saved from complete annihilation by the arrival of reinforcements from Boston. By the time they finally stumbled back into the city, nearly 300 of their men were killed, wounded, or missing. The colonists had proven that they were not just a rabble. They were a determined and capable fighting force. The battles of Lexington and Concord were a profound shock to both sides. The British had grossly underestimated the colonists' wheel 2 feet. The colonists, in turn, had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. What began as a protest over taxes and representation had now escalated into armed conflict. The war for American independence had begun. The news spread, and thousands of militia from all over New England began to converge on Boston, trapping the British Army inside the city. The siege of Boston had started, and the revolution was now in full swing. From a symbolic act of defiance in Boston Harbor to the first shots of a long and bloody war, the path from protest to revolution was rapid and decisive. The events of 1773 to 1775 transformed a political dispute into a military conflict that would ultimately give birth to a new nation. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story is far from over, and in our next episode, we'll see how the Second Continental Congress responds to the outbreak of war and witness the first major battle at Bunker Hill. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. See you in the next video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into Chapter 18, Legacy of Defiance. We're going to explore how a single night of protest in Boston Harbor rippled through time, becoming a powerful, enduring symbol of resistance against tyranny. How did the Boston Tea Party, an act of defiance over tea and taxes, become a cornerstone of the American identity and inspire countless others around the globe? Let's find out. December 16th, 1773. Over 100 men, disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. It was more than just a protest against the Tea Act. It was a bold declaration. It was a statement that taxation without representation was an intolerable injustice. This act of civil disobedience was a calculated risk, a point of no return for the colonists. They weren't just destroying property, they were destroying the illusion of colonial submission. The British response was swift and harsh. They passed the coercive acts, or as the colonists called them, the intolerable acts. These laws closed Boston Harbor, dismantled the Massachusetts government, and quartered British troops in private homes. But instead of crushing the rebellion, these measures backfired spectacularly. They didn't isolate Boston, they united the colonies. The intolerable acts galvanized the other colonies into action. They saw Boston's punishment as a threat to their own freedoms. If Britain could do this to Massachusetts, they could do it to anyone. This shared fear and outrage led to the convening of the First Continental Congress in 1774. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met to formulate a unified response. The Tea Party had turned a debate over taxes into a full-blown crisis of sovereignty. It was the spark that lit the flame of revolution. The event demonstrated that ordinary citizens, when united, could challenge the might of an empire. It was a masterclass in political theater, a spectacle designed to be seen and heard across the Atlantic. The message was clear. American colonists would not be treated as mere subjects. but as free people with rights. The symbolism of the Tea Party was incredibly potent. It wasn't a riot. It was an organized, almost ceremonial act of protest. The participants were careful not to damage the ships themselves or steal anything besides the tea. This discipline highlighted the political nature of their actions. They weren't common criminals. They were patriots making a principled stand. This image of principled resistance became a foundational story for the new nation. It was a story of David versus Goliath, of common people standing up to an oppressive power. This narrative was woven into the fabric of American identity, taught to school children, and retold in countless books and speeches. It cemented the idea that questioning authority and, when necessary, defying it, was not only a right, but a civic duty. As the years and decades passed, the legacy of the Boston Tea Party continued to grow. It wasn't just a historical event, it became a living symbol. During the 19th century, abolitionists and suffragettes drew inspiration from the Tea Party's example of civil disobedience. They saw their own struggles for freedom and equality as a continuation of the spirit of 1773. When Susan B. Anthony and other women's rights activists protested for the right to vote, they were echoing the cry of no taxation without representation. They argued that if they were to be governed and taxed, they deserved a voice in that government. The Tea Party provided a historical precedent for challenging unjust laws through direct, nonviolent action. It legitimized their cause, grounding it in the nation's own revolutionary origins. The influence of the Boston Tea Party extends far beyond American shores. It has become a global touchstone for protest movements. Perhaps one of the most famous examples is Mahatma Gandhi's Salt March in 1930 in India. Gandhi led thousands of his countrymen on a 240-mile march to the Arabian Sea to make their own salt. In defiance of a British law that gave the empire a monopoly on salt production and sales, Gandhi himself explicitly cited the Boston Tea Party as an inspiration for his campaign of civil disobedience. He saw the parallel, a protest against a tax on a common household item, used to symbolize and challenge the legitimacy of colonial rule. Just like the American colonists, Gandhi understood the power of a symbolic act to mobilize a population and expose the injustice of an imperial system. From the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa to the pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square, the spirit of the Tea Party resonates. It's the idea that a small, committed group of citizens can ignite a massive change. The act of targeting a specific symbol of oppression, be it tea, salt, or a statue, is a tactic that has been used time and time again. It's a way of making a complex political issue tangible and understandable to the masses. The Tea Party taught the world that defiance doesn't always have to come from the barrel of a gun. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is a refusal to comply, a collective act of saying no. This legacy is a testament to the enduring power of people who dare to stand up for their rights. Even in modern America, the Tea Party's name has been invoked. In the early 21st century, a political movement calling itself the Tea Party emerged, protesting what they saw as excessive government spending and taxation. While the historical context and specific goals were vastly different, their choice of name was deliberate. They sought to connect their modern grievances to the nation's founding act of tax protests. This shows just how deeply the Boston Tea Party is embedded in the American political psyche. It remains a flexible and potent symbol that different groups can adapt to their own causes, rightly or wrongly. It proves that the story of those men in Boston Harbor is not just history. It is a continuous, evolving part of the American conversation about liberty, government, and the rights of the individual. So, what is the ultimate legacy of defiance left by the Boston Tea Party? It's the powerful idea that government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. It's the principle that when that consent is violated, people have the right to resist. The Tea Party wasn't the beginning of the American Revolution, but it was the moment the argument shifted from debate to direct confrontation. It transformed protesters into patriots and set the colonies on an irreversible path to independence. It created a heroic national myth that has inspired generations of Americans and activists worldwide to challenge injustice and fight for a better, freer world. The legacy of the Boston Tea Party is a reminder that history is not just made by generals and presidents, but by ordinary citizens who, in a moment of crisis, Choose to be brave. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the legacy of the Boston Tea Party. A story that continues to shape our world in profound ways. If you found this discussion insightful, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more explorations into the moments that defined our history. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We love hearing from you, so please share your thoughts on the Tea Party's legacy in the comments below. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our channel. We're standing here in modern-day Boston, a city buzzing with energy. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes of the past. 3 centuries ago, this very harbor became the stage for one of the most audacious acts of protest in American history: the Boston Tea Party. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of time and explore how this pivotal moment, the Harbor Rebellion, is remembered and relived right here in the 21st century. Our first stop is the magnificent Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum, located right on the Fort Point Channel. Look at these beauties. These are full-scale replica 18th century vessels, the Beaver and the Eleanor. Stepping aboard is like stepping into a time machine. You're not just looking at exhibits behind glass. You're on the very decks where history was made. The museum does an incredible job of making the past tangible. You can feel the wood, smell the salt in the air, and imagine the tension that filled this harbor on that cold December night in 1773. It's one thing to read about the Sons of Liberty, but here you meet Dame. Live actors, dressed in period clothing, bring figures like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere to life. They don't just recite facts. They pull you into the story, debating the tyranny of British taxation and rallying the crowd for action. You become part of the town meeting, so Thinger has us, alongside your fellow colonists. It is an immersive experience that transforms you from a passive observer into an active participant in the rebellion. And then comes the moment everyone is waiting for, the chance to heave tea into the harbor. The museum provides replica tea chests, surprisingly heavy, and you get to join the raiders in tossing them overboard. As the crates splash into the water below, you get a small, thrilling taste of that defiance spirit. It's a powerful, hands-on way to understand the colonists' frustration and their bold statement against taxation without representation. It's not just for kids. I saw people of all ages getting swept up in the revolutionary fervor. Of course, the original site of the protest, Griffin's Wharf, no longer exists as it did in 1773. Over the centuries, Boston's coastline has been reshaped by landfill and development, but the city hasn't let this important landmark be forgotten. Just a short walk from the museum, you'll find a commemorative plaque marking the approximate location of the original wharf. It's a quieter, more contemplative spot. Standing here, you can reflect on the gravity of what happened. This wasn't just a theatrical stunt. It was a hystix act of civil disobedience that set the colonies on a direct path to war and, ultimately, independence. The spirit of the Tea Party is also kept alive through annual reenactments. Every December 16th, hundreds of reenactors and thousands of spectators gather to recreate the event in meticulous detail. It starts with a fiery debate at the Old South Meeting House, the very same building where the colonists held their final, fateful meeting. The arguments are passionate, the atmosphere electric. You can feel the escalating anger and resolve in the room. It's a living history lesson that unfolds in real time. As dusk falls, the procession, led by fife and drum, marches from the meeting house down to the harbor. The crowd follows, lanterns in hand, creating a truly spectacular sight. The reenactors, portraying the Sons of Liberty, then board the ships, and once again, tea is thrown into the water. This annual tradition is more than just a performance. It's a community ritual, a powerful reminder of the city's rebellious soul and its central role in the nation's founding. It connects Bostonians today directly to their revolutionary ancestors. Seeing these reenactments and visiting the museum really drives home how the Boston Tea Party was an unisolated incident. It was the culmination of years of simmering resentment over British policies like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. The Tea Act of 1773 was simply the final straw. It wasn't about the price of tea. It was about the principle of self-governance. The colonists believed that only their own elected representatives had the right to tax them. This event had massive repercussions. In response to the destruction of the tea, a furious British Parliament passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. They closed Boston Harbor, shut down local government, and quartered British troops in private homes. But instead of crushing the rebellion, these punitive measures united the colonies in opposition. They rallied to support Boston, and within a year, the First Continental Congress had convened, laying the groundwork for the American Revolution. So, when you walk through Boston today, remember that the history of the Harbor Rebellion is all around you. It's in the replica ships bobbing in the water, in the commemorative plaque on the waterfront, and in the passionate voices of the reenactors who keep the story alive. It's a testament to how a group of determined citizens, standing up for their rights, could change the course of history. Their act of defiance over 350,000 pounds of tea lit a fire that would forge a new nation. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time to remember the Boston Harbor Rebellion. It's a story of defiance, principle, and the enduring power of protest. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And do you not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next historical adventure. Until next time, stay curious. Hello, and welcome back. We've journeyed together through the winding streets of colonial America, through bustling ports and quiet town halls, tracing the simmering tensions that led to a revolutionary boiling point. Tonight, we arrive at our final destination, a moment captured forever in the cold, dark waters of Boston Harbor. This is Chapter 20, The Last Drop of Freedom. As we draw our story to a close, let's take a moment to breathe and reflect on the quiet power of a single act. Imagine the scene. A crisp, cold December night in 1773. The air is thick with the smell of salt water and the unspoken anxieties of a city on edge. The moon casts a silvery glow on the harbor, illuminating the silhouettes of 3 British ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. They sit there, heavy with their cargo, unaware they are about to become the stage for one of history's most iconic protests. 4 weeks, the colonists had debated, pleaded, and warned. The Tea Act was not just about a tax. It was about a principle. It was the latest in a long line of grievances, a symbol of a distant government imposing its will without consent. The colonists felt their rights as Englishmen slipping through their fingers, like grains of sand. They had tried every peaceful means, sending petitions, holding town meetings, and demanding that the tea be sent back to England, unopened. But Governor Thomas Hutchinson was resolute. The duty must be paid. The tea must be landed. The deadline was fast approaching. So, on the night of December 16th, the talking stopped. From the Old South Meeting House, a signal was given. A crowd of thousands had gathered, their collective breath held in anticipation. Then, disguised as Mohawk Indienza, symbolic act to distinguish themselves as Americans, not British subjects, a group of men, the Sons of Liberty, emerged from the shadows. They moved with a determined silence, not the chaos of a riot, but the focused energy of a mission. They marched down to Griffin's Wharf, their footsteps echoing a resolve that had been hardening for years. They were tradesmen, artisans, merchants, and laborers, ordinary people driven to an extraordinary act. Boarding the ships, they worked methodically under the moonlight. The silence of the night was broken only by the rhythmic splintering of wooden chests and the heavy splash of tea plunging into the icy harbor. Chest after chest, 342 in total, were hoisted, broken open, and their contents poured into the dark water. It wasn't an act of vandalism for its own sake. It was a carefully orchestrated political statement, a public rejection of parliamentary authority. Think about the sheer audacity of it. This wasn't just a few disgruntled men letting off steam. This was a direct, public, and expensive challenge to the most powerful empire in the world. They weren't just dumping tea. They were dumping a legacy of subservience. Each broken chest was a broken chain. Each splash in the harbor was a ripple that would soon become a tidal wave, washing over all 13 colonies. The scent of tea, that comforting aroma of domesticity, now filled the Boston air with the fragrance of rebellion. The British response was swift and severe. They didn't see a protest for liberty. They saw an act of insurrection. Parliament passed the coercive acts, or, as the colonists grimly called them, the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed. The Massachusetts government was dissolved. and British soldiers were quartered in private homes. Instead of crushing the rebellious spirit, these punitive measures did the opposite. They united the colonies in a way nothing else had. The plight of Boston became the cause of all. What started in one harbor now echoed in every colonial assembly, from New Hampshire to Georgia. It's fascinating how a single moment can become a catalyst for immense change. The Boston Tea Party wasn't the start of the war, but it was the point of no return. It transformed a debate over taxes into a fight for freedom itself. The choice was no longer between compliance and protests, but between submission and independence. The argument moved from the courthouse and the assembly hall to the battlefield. And so, as we end our journey, let's leave the noise of the coming battles behind and return to that quiet, powerful image. Picture it one last time. A few hundred men, a few dozen barrels, and a harbor turned into a giant, bitter teapot. A simple act of defiance that became a profound declaration. It's a testament to the idea that sometimes the most powerful statements are made not with words, but with actions. It shows that a small group of determined individuals can indeed alter the course of history. This event, this single night, became the seed from which a new nation would grow. It was a poetic act of defiance, a final, symbolic rejection of a relationship that had become toxic and unjust. A few barrels of tea, dumped into the cold, dark waters of the Atlantic, became the last drop of freedom they were willing to give up, and the first sip of the liberty they were determined to win. As you drift off to sleep tonight, hold this image in your mind. From the dark waters of Boston Harbor rose the dawn of American liberty. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical journey. I hope these stories have been as fascinating for you to hear as they have been for me to tell. If you've enjoyed our time together, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps, more than you know. Until we meet again, sleep well.